It doesn't happen very often here on YouTube because the algorithm mostly shows my videos to smart people, which probably explains why my audience is so small. But in real, unfiltered life, every once in a while I hear things like, "That's just your opinion. Everyone has their own truth." Or, "Logic is subjective." Frankly, I've had enough of this bullshit, and it's time to dismantle this nonsense once and for all. Relativism isn't a philosophical position, it's intellectual paralysis disguised as tolerance. I'm going to show you exactly how this cognitive virus operates and why it needs to be eliminated from serious discourse. Relativism claims that everyone has their own truth, their own logic, and their own reality. This sounds wonderfully democratic and inclusive until you realize what this actually means in practice. There is no truth at all. The relativists cannot distinguish between facts and interpretations. They treat mathematical statements like 2 by 2 equals 4 and subjective preferences like "I enjoy green" as equally subjective opinions that exist on the same epistemic level. When someone says they have their own logic, what they really mean is that they have their own system of associations and emotional responses. But logic isn't a matter of personal taste like choosing ice cream flavors. Logic is a tool for checking statements against contradictions, and it operates according to specific rules. You can either follow these rules correctly or violate them incorrectly. And when you violate them, you're simply wrong, not creatively different. Here's where relativism becomes genuinely fascinating in its self destruction. When a relativist declares truth doesn't exist, we can immediately ask whether this statement itself is true or false. If it's true, then truth exists and we have a contradiction. If it's false, then the relativist should stop talking because they've just admitted they're wrong about their central claim. Similarly, when someone announces that everything is subjective, we can ask whether this includes their own statement about subjectivity. If it does, then the statement has no universal significance and can be dismissed based on anyone's subjective preference to ignore it. My personal favorite is when relativists proclaim that nothing can be asserted with certainty, while asserting this principle with complete confidence. This creates what philosophers call a performative contradiction. The act of speaking destroys the content of what's being said. Relativism stands alone as the only philosophical position that refutes itself in the moment of its articulation, which should tell us something important about its logical viability. Relativists love to declare that everyone has their own reality. But this fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between perception and facts. Each person has their own model of reality, their own interpretive framework, and their own cognitive limitations. But models can be tested against factual evidence and compared for accuracy and predictive power. When an airplane crashes, this isn't an interpretation or a matter of perspective. It's an unlikely but measurable event that occurred in physical space and time. Your emotional reaction to the crash, your cultural framework for understanding aviation disasters, and your personal associations with flying are all subjective elements, but the actual impact of metal against ground follows physical laws regardless of anyone's opinions about aviation safety. The next time someone tells you that something is subjective, ask them to specify exactly what they mean. Are they talking about the facts themselves, or about human responses to those facts. These are fundamentally different categories that cannot be collapsed together without destroying the possibility of rational discourse. Now we reach the most crucial point about relativism's role in contemporary culture. It operates as a meta strategy for protecting ideas from logical analysis. Any claim, no matter how obviously false or internally contradictory, can be defended by invoking the magic phrase, "That's just your interpretation." This immediately shifts the conversation away from evidence and reasoning. Relativism persists because it serves power. It disables verification, dissolves standards, and protects lies from being exposed. The system isn't confused by accident. It's engineered this way. The more uncertain everything feels, the harder it becomes to oppose anything. When you point out that someone is contradicting themselves, the relativist responds that contradiction is a Western concept that doesn't apply to their thinking. When you demonstrate that their approach produces no measurable results, they claim that effectiveness is subjective and their method works for them personally. When you identify manipulative behavior, they insist that manipulation is simply how you choose to interpret their actions. It's as labeling something an interpretation somehow makes it immune to factual verification. Relativism makes it impossible to say this is false, this contains logical errors, or this contradicts the available evidence. Any attempt at verification gets blocked by appeals to subjectivity and personal truth. Relativism has embedded itself throughout contemporary culture, creating a comprehensive framework for avoiding intellectual responsibility. In therapeutic contexts, the principle "we don't judge, we accept" sounds compassionate and humanistic, but it often translates into an inability to distinguish between healthy and destructive behavioral patterns. Media organizations frequently present issues as if the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But if one person claims the temperature outside is 70 degrees while another insists it's 30 degrees, the actual temperature isn't 50 degrees just because we've found a numerical midpoint between two conflicting claims. Consider the claim that logic is a Western invention, which demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of what logic actually represents. Logic isn't invented or created by cultures, it's discovered through the analysis of valid reasoning patterns. Logical principles operate independently of cultural contexts, just like mathematical or physical laws. When someone insists that everyone has their own 2 by 2, they're confusing numerical systems with numerical relationships. You can express the concept of two groups of two objects using different symbolic systems, binary, decimal, Roman numerals, but within any consistent system, the relationship remain logically determined rather than subjectively chosen. The phrase, "that's just your interpretation," gets deployed whenever someone wants to avoid engaging with factual claims. But interpretation and measurement represent different cognitive activities. When a thermometer reads 98.6 degrees, that's a measurement based on physical properties. When you decide that 98.6 indicates health or illness, that's an interpretation based on medical knowledge and contextual factors. The alternative to relativism isn't dogmatism or authoritarian thinking. It's logical verification and evidence based reasoning. Instead of declaring that everything is equally valid, we can develop criteria for distinguishing between claims that can be tested and claims that cannot be tested. We can separate arguments that follow logical principles from arguments that violate those principles. Logic doesn't represent violence against opinion or an assault on creativity. It provides navigation tools for moving through complex information landscapes and distinguishing between statements that correspond to measurable reality and statements that reflect personal preferences or cultural assumptions. When someone makes a factual claim, logic helps us determine whether that claim can be verified, what evidence would support or refute it, and how it relates to other established knowledge. Truth is the correspondence between statements and measurable conditions. Truth is structural, not democratic. It doesn't care about votes or feelings. If you claim there's an apple on the table and there's actually an orange on the table, you're not expressing a different cultural perspective or alternative way of knowing. You're simply incorrect about what's sitting on the table, and this error can be corrected through direct observation. Relativism presents itself as a tolerance for diverse perspectives, but it actually represents the abandonment of any meaningful distinction between truth and falsehood, between accurate and inaccurate claims, between logical and illogical reasoning. This isn't a philosophical sophistication, it's intellectual surrender disguised as wisdom. It makes serious discourse impossible by eliminating the shared standards that allow people to evaluate competing claims. The next time someone tells you that everyone has their own truth, you can ask them whether this includes the claim that everyone has their own truth. Watch how quickly they begin searching for an escape route from their logical trap. The real truth is simple. Either you have evidence and logical arguments supporting your position, or you don't. Everything else represents various sophisticated methods for avoiding the hard work of actual thinking.